On July 26, 1974, a young girl walking her dog along the remote dunes of Race Point Beach in Provincetown, Massachusetts, stumbled upon a scene that would become one of Cape Cod's most enduring mysteries. Partially buried in the sand, covered by beach grass and a faded blue bandana, lay the decomposed remains of a woman. Her hands had been severed and removed, likely to prevent identification through fingerprints. Her head bore evidence of severe trauma, suggesting she had been brutally beaten before death. The woman appeared to be between 20 and 40 years old, with reddish-brown hair that had been styled in a manner consistent with early 1970s fashion. She wore only blue jeans, folded neatly and placed beneath her body, and several pieces of jewelry, including distinctive rings and a necklace that investigators hoped might provide clues to her identity. Despite the remote location and the obvious attempt to conceal the crime, someone had taken care to position the body in what appeared to be a respectful manner, adding an element of contradiction to an already puzzling scene. The initial investigation launched by the Massachusetts State Police and local authorities was hampered by the advanced state of decomposition and the deliberate removal of the victim's hands. Without fingerprints or dental records to compare against missing person reports, investigators had to rely on physical descriptions and the few personal effects found with the body. The victim's dental work was examined and found to be of high quality, suggesting she had access to good dental care and possibly came from a middle-class background. Her jewelry, while not particularly expensive, showed distinctive craftsmanship that investigators hoped someone might recognize. The blue jeans were traced to a manufacturer, but the style was common enough that this provided little useful information. Local police canvassed the area extensively, interviewing residents and seasonal workers who might have seen anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the discovery. Despite these efforts, no missing person reports matched the victim's description, and no witnesses came forward with information about suspicious activity in the area. For nearly 5 decades, the unidentified woman became known as the Lady of the Dunes, a moniker that transformed a brutal murder into something approaching local folklore. The mystery captured the imagination of amateur investigators, conspiracy theorists, and true crime enthusiasts who proposed increasingly elaborate theories about her identity and the circumstances of her death. Some suggested she might have been connected to organized crime, pointing to the professional manner in which her hands had been removed. Others theorized about connections to the entertainment industry, noting that several films had been shot in the Provincetown area around the time of her death. The most persistent theory involved the 1975 film Jaws, with some claiming the victim could be seen as an extra in certain scenes, though this was never substantiated. Internet forums buzzed with speculation about everything from witness protection programs to cult activities, each theory more sensational than the last. The case attracted national attention periodically, particularly when new investigative techniques offered hope for resolution, but each promising lead eventually led to another dead end. The breakthrough that would finally solve this enduring mystery came through the same genetic genealogy techniques that had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. In 2021, the Massachusetts State Police partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a genetic analysis company specializing in phenotyping and genetic genealogy. Using advanced DNA extraction methods, scientists were able to obtain a usable genetic profile from the victims' remains, despite their age and condition. This genetic material was then analyzed to create both a phenotype prediction, showing what the woman likely looked like in life, and a genealogical profile that could be compared against DNA databases. The phenotyping analysis confirmed many of the original estimates about the victim's appearance, showing a woman with fair skin, brown hair, and hazel eyes. More importantly, the genetic profile provided a roadmap for genealogical investigators to follow as they worked to identify potential family connections. The genetic genealogy investigation was led by C.C. Moore, a prominent figure in the field, who had gained recognition for her work on numerous cold cases. Moore and her team began the painstaking process of constructing family trees based on DNA matches found in genealogical databases. The work required not only scientific analysis, but also traditional genealogical research, as investigators traced family lines across multiple generations and geographic locations. Initial matches pointed to families with roots in New England and eastern Canada, providing a general geographic focus for the investigation. As the family tree grew more detailed, investigators were able to narrow their focus to specific family lines and began reaching out to potential relatives for additional DNA samples. The process was methodical and time-consuming, requiring investigators to verify family relationships and eliminate false matches, while slowly building toward a definitive identification. The decisive breakthrough came in early 2022, when genetic genealogists identified a specific family line that appeared to match the victim's DNA profile. This led investigators to focus on Ruth Marie Terry, a woman who had been reported missing from Tennessee in 1974, around the same time the body was discovered in Massachusetts. Terry had been born Ruth Marie Magoon in 1945 in Maine, and had lived in various locations throughout New England before moving to Tennessee. She had been married to Guy Moldavan, a man with a history of violence and suspected involvement in other disappearances. According to family members, Terry had been in an abusive relationship and had attempted to leave Moldavan multiple times before her disappearance. When contacted by investigators, Terry's surviving family members provided DNA samples that confirmed the match beyond any doubt. After 48 years, the Lady of the Dunes finally had a name and a story that was far removed from the elaborate theories that had surrounded her case for decades. The investigation into Ruth Marie Terry's murder revealed a tragic tale of domestic violence that bore little resemblance to the exotic theories that had circulated for years. Terry had married Guy Moldavan in 1974, but the relationship quickly became abusive. Moldavan had a criminal history that included charges related to violence against women and was suspected in the disappearances of at least 2 other women, including his previous wife. According to investigators, Terry had attempted to leave Moldavan in the summer of 1974, leading to the confrontation that likely resulted in her death. Moldavan had connections to the Cape Cod area and would have been familiar with the remote location where Terry's body was found. The careful positioning of her body and the removal of her hands suggested someone with knowledge of forensic investigation techniques, consistent with Moldavan's criminal background. However, any opportunity for justice had been lost to time, as Moldavan himself had died in 2002, taking with him any definitive answers about the circumstances of Terry's death. On October 31, 2022, the Massachusetts State Police held a press conference to announce that the Lady of the Dunes had been identified as Ruth Marie Terry. Cape and Islands District Attorney Michael O'Keefe spoke about the significance of finally being able to give the victim back her name and provide closure to her family members who had wondered about her fate for nearly 5 decades. The announcement brought an end to one of Massachusetts' longest-running unsolved cases, but also highlighted the tragic reality that often lay behind such mysteries. Detective Lieutenant Ray Bates, who had worked on the case for several years, noted that while the identification provided important answers, it also served as a reminder of the devastating impact of domestic violence and the need for better support systems for victims seeking to escape abusive relationships. The identification of Ruth Marie Terry represented a triumph of modern forensic science over the passage of time, but it also demonstrated how reality could be more tragic and mundane than the elaborate theories that often surrounded unsolved cases. The genetic genealogy techniques that made her identification possible had transformed cold case investigations, allowing investigators to solve cases that had seemed hopeless just a few years earlier. Terry's case joined a growing list of long unidentified victims who had been given back their names through these methods, providing closure to families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their loved ones. The resolution also highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed records and evidence, as the careful preservation of physical evidence from 1974 had made the eventual identification possible. The story of Ruth Marie Terry also served as a sobering reminder about the realities of domestic violence and the vulnerabilities faced by women attempting to escape abusive relationships. The elaborate theories that had surrounded her case for decades had obscured the simple, tragic truth that she had been a victim of intimate partner violence, a crime that claimed thousands of lives each year across the United States. Her murder had occurred during an era when domestic violence was less well understood and less aggressively prosecuted than it would become in later decades. The identification of Terry brought attention not only to her individual tragedy, but also to the broader social issues that had contributed to her vulnerability. While the scientific breakthrough that identified her was cause for celebration among investigators and forensic genealogists, it also underscored the need for continued efforts to prevent domestic violence and protect potential victims. The resolution of the Lady of the Dunes case marked the end of nearly 5 decades of speculation and theory, replacing mystery with the hard truth of domestic violence and murder. Ruth Marie Terry had been transformed from a local legend into a real person with a family, a history, and a tragic end that was all too common. The case demonstrated both the power of modern forensic science to provide answers to long-standing questions and the importance of remembering that behind every unsolved case was a real person whose life had value and whose death demanded justice, even if that justice could only come in the form of truth and remembrance. The woman who had been known only as the Lady of the Dunes for 48 years had finally reclaimed her identity as Ruth Marie Terry, though the full circumstances of her death would remain partially shrouded by the passage of time and the death of her suspected killer. The Sodder Children. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, stood as a beacon of warmth and anticipation in the cold mountain night. George and Jenny Sodder, had built a life centered around their 9 children, ranging in age from 2 to 23, and their modest 2-story home buzzed with the excitement of Christmas morning just hours away. George Sauter, an Italian immigrant who had come to America seeking opportunity, had established a successful trucking business and was known throughout the community as a hard-working man who provided well for his large family. Jenny, his devoted wife, managed the household with the efficiency required to care for so many children, and together they had created a close-knit family unit that was respected in their small West Virginia community. The evening of December 24th had unfolded like countless others, with the children playing, the family sharing dinner, and the parents ensuring that Christmas preparations were complete for the magical morning that lay ahead. As the family prepared for bed on that fateful Christmas Eve, 10 people were present in the Sauter home, George and Jenny, along with 9 of their children. The eldest daughter, Marion, was already married and living elsewhere, while the remaining children ranged from 2-year-old Sylvia to 23-year-old John. The middle children included 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. Also present were 17-year-old George Jr. and 16-year-old Jenny, creating a bustling household typical of large families in that era. The children had spent the evening in various activities, with some playing games, others helping with Christmas preparations, and the youngest ones being readied for bed with the promise that Santa Claus would visit during the night. George and Jenny had allowed the children to stay up later than usual in celebration of Christmas Eve, but eventually began the process of getting everyone settled for the night, looking forward to the joy and chaos that Christmas morning would bring to their home. In the early morning hours of December 25th, 1945, Jenny Sauter was awakened by the sound of the telephone ringing. When she answered, a woman's voice asked for someone who was not a member of the Sauter family, and when Jenny explained that the caller had reached the wrong number, the woman laughed strangely and hung up. Jenny found the call odd but returned to bed, only to be awakened again around 1:30 a.m. by a loud crash on the roof, followed by the sound of something rolling across the roofline before falling to the ground. Still groggy, and assuming it might be related to the wind, or perhaps some object that had been blown against the house, Jenny again tried to return to sleep. It was not until approximately 30 minutes later that she noticed an acrid smell and the unmistakable orange glow of flames visible through her bedroom window. Awakening George immediately, she screamed, "Fire!" and the couple began the desperate process of evacuating their family from the rapidly spreading blaze that was consuming their home with terrifying speed. George and Jenny managed to escape the house, along with 4 of their children, 17-year-old George Jr., 16-year-old Jenny, 12-year-old Martha, and 2-year-old Sylvia. In the chaos and terror of the moment, they realized that 5 children remained trapped inside the burning structure: 14-year-old Maurice, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, 5-year-old Betty, and 23-year-old John. George immediately attempted to re-enter the house to rescue the missing children, but the intensity of the fire and the spreading flames made this impossible. He ran to where he normally kept a ladder that would allow him to reach the second-story windows where he believed the children might be trapped, but the ladder was inexplicably missing from its usual location. Desperate to reach his children, George then attempted to move one of his trucks closer to the house so he could climb onto it and reach the upper windows. But both of his vehicles refused to start, despite having operated normally the previous day. The Fayetteville Fire Department was contacted, but their response was delayed and ultimately ineffective in saving either the house or the children believed to be trapped inside. The fire department's equipment was located several miles away, and by the time firefighters arrived at the scene, the house had been reduced to smoldering ruins. The fire had burned with such intensity and speed that the entire structure was consumed within approximately 30 to 45 minutes, leaving only the foundation and scattered debris. Despite the family's desperate pleas and George's frantic attempts to rescue his children, no one had been able to re-enter the house once the fire had taken hold. The fire department made no attempt to search for survivors or recover bodies while the ruins were still hot, citing the danger of unstable debris and the assumption that any remains would be recovered once the site had cooled sufficiently for safe excavation. When investigators and family members were finally able to search through the ashes and debris of the Sodder home, they made a discovery that would haunt the family for decades. No human remains were found, despite the intensity of the fire, which should have left at least some bone fragments or other physical evidence of the 5 missing children. The ruins yielded nothing that could be identified as human remains. This absence of physical evidence immediately raised questions about what had actually happened during the fire. George and Jenny had expected to find the bodies of their children, or, at minimum, some evidence of their presence in the house during the fire. But the complete absence of any such evidence suggested possibilities that were almost too horrific to contemplate. Fire investigators assured the family that bodies could be completely consumed in intense fires. But George, who had experience with fires through his work, found this explanation inadequate given the specific circumstances of their house fire. As the initial shock and grief began to give way to questions and investigation, disturbing details about the night of the fire began to emerge. The telephone line to the Sodder home had been cut, which explained why George had been unable to call for help immediately when the fire started. The missing ladder was eventually found in a ravine, approximately 75 feet from the house, apparently having been deliberately moved from its normal storage location. George's trucks, which had refused to start during the emergency, were examined and found to have been sabotaged, with their electrical systems tampered with in a way that would prevent them from operating. These discoveries suggested that the fire had not been an accident, but rather a carefully planned event designed to trap the family in their home while preventing them from escaping or calling for help. The deliberate nature of these acts of sabotage convinced George and Jenny that their children had not died in the fire, but had instead been kidnapped as part of an elaborate scheme. The Sodder family's suspicions about the true nature of the Christmas Eve fire were reinforced by several threatening incidents that had occurred in the months leading up to the blaze. George Sodder had been an outspoken critic of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and had frequently expressed his opposition to fascism in conversations with other Italian immigrants in the area. These political views had apparently angered some members of the local Italian community who supported Mussolini, leading to several confrontational encounters. In the months before the fire, George had received visits from men who warned him to keep his political opinions to himself or face consequences. One insurance salesman had told George that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of his anti-Mussolini stance. A local fire chief had made similar threatening comments, suggesting that George's house would be burned and his children would be harmed. These threats, combined with the evidence of sabotage on the night of the fire, convinced the Sodders that their family had been targeted for George's political beliefs. The official investigation into the fire and the disappearance of the 5 Sodder children was marked by inconsistencies and apparent indifference from local authorities. The fire was quickly ruled accidental, despite the evidence of sabotage, and the absence of human remains was explained away as the result of the fire's intensity. The coroner issued death certificates for the 5 missing children without conducting a thorough investigation or adequately explaining the lack of physical evidence. When George and Jenny pressed for a more comprehensive investigation, they encountered resistance from local law enforcement and officials who seemed eager to close the case and move on. The family's requests for assistance from state and federal authorities were largely ignored, and their attempts to hire private investigators yielded few concrete results. The apparent lack of official interest in pursuing the case only strengthened the Sodders' conviction that there had been a conspiracy to cover up what had really happened to their children. For 20 years following the fire, George and Jenny Sodder continued their own investigation into their children's disappearance, following up on tips, hiring private investigators, and maintaining hope that their children were alive somewhere. They erected a billboard along Route 16 that displayed photographs of the missing children and offered a reward for information about their whereabouts. The billboard became a local landmark and kept the case in the public consciousness, generating occasional tips and leads that the family pursued with desperate hope. In 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder received a mysterious envelope in the mail that contained a photograph of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to their son Louis, who would have been in his 30s by that time. The photograph was accompanied by a handwritten note that read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Ilil boys, A Naya 132, or similar cryptic text. The back of the photograph contained what appeared to be the name of a city, possibly in Kentucky. The mysterious photograph energized the Sodders' investigation and seemed to provide the first concrete evidence in decades that at least one of their children might still be alive. Jenny immediately contacted private investigators and asked them to travel to Kentucky to investigate the possible connection suggested by the photograph. However, the investigation in Kentucky yielded no useful information, and the private investigators were unable to locate anyone who could provide additional details about the photograph or its origin. The photograph itself was analyzed by experts who confirmed that it appeared to be genuine and had likely been taken in the 1960s, making it chronologically possible that it could indeed show Louis Sodder as an adult. However, without additional evidence or corroborating information, the photograph remained simply another tantalizing clue in a case that had produced many leads but no definitive answers. As the decades passed and George and Jenny Sodder aged, their active investigation into their children's disappearance gradually slowed, though they never abandoned hope that the truth would eventually be revealed. George Sodder died in 1969 having spent the last 24 years of his life searching for his missing children and trying to uncover the truth about what happened on Christmas Eve 1945. Jenny continued the investigation until her own death in 1989, maintaining the billboard and following up on occasional tips and leads that still trickled in from time to time. The surviving Sodder children, who had escaped the fire, continued their parents' quest for answers, though with less intensity, as their own lives and families demanded their attention. The case remained officially unsolved, with local authorities maintaining their position that the 5 children had died in the fire. Despite the persistent questions about the lack of physical evidence and the signs of sabotage, the Sodder children case has remained one of America's most enduring missing person mysteries, representing either a tragic accident compounded by investigative failures or a successful kidnapping that was covered up by a conspiracy involving local officials. The complete absence of physical remains continues to be the most compelling aspect of the case, as modern fire investigation techniques and knowledge about body destruction in fires suggest that some evidence should have survived even the most intense blaze. The evidence of sabotage, including the cut phone line, moved ladder, and disabled vehicles, strongly suggests that the fire was not accidental, while the threatening incidents in the months preceding the fire provide a potential motive for the attack. However, the lack of any concrete evidence about what happened to the children after their supposed rescue, and the failure of decades of investigation to produce any verified sightings or contacts, leaves the case in a state of permanent uncertainty. The mystery of the Sodder children has been complicated by the passage of time and the deaths of most of the people who were directly involved in the original investigation. Modern law enforcement agencies have occasionally reviewed the case using contemporary investigative techniques, but the lack of physical evidence and the deterioration of witness memories have made significant progress unlikely. The case has been featured in numerous true crime books, documentaries, and television programs, keeping it in the public consciousness and occasionally generating new tips or theories. But none of these have led to any breakthrough in understanding what actually happened. The surviving members of the Sodder family continue to believe that their siblings were kidnapped and possibly lived full lives elsewhere under different identities, while skeptics maintain that the children died in the fire, and that the absence of remains can be explained by the unusual circumstances of the blaze. The legacy of the Sodder children case extends beyond the specific mystery of what happened on Christmas Eve 1945, serving as an example of how cases can remain unsolved when initial investigations are inadequate and when official authorities are unwilling or unable to pursue all possible explanations. The case has also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the 1940s and the importance of preserving physical evidence and conducting thorough investigations immediately following traumatic events. Whether the 5 Sodder children died in the fire or were successfully kidnapped and hidden for the rest of their lives, their story remains a haunting reminder of how violence can shatter families and how unanswered questions can torment survivors for generations. The Christmas Eve fire that destroyed the Sodder home took more than just a house and possibly 5 lives. It created a mystery that has endured for nearly 8 decades and may never be definitively resolved. Tanya Gatlin. In the early morning hours of June 2, 1984, A trucker driving along Highway 155 near Tyler, Texas, spotted what appeared to be clothing scattered along the roadside. When he stopped to investigate, he discovered the body of a young woman who had been discarded in the tall grass beside the highway like refuse. The victim appeared to be in her 20s, with brown hair and a slender build, wearing simple clothing that provided no immediate clues to her identity. She had been strangled, her life extinguished with brutal efficiency, before her body was dumped in this desolate location. The scene suggested a hasty disposal rather than a carefully planned crime, as if someone had simply wanted to remove her from their life as quickly and quietly as possible. When investigators processed the scene, they found no purse, no wallet, no identification of any kind. The woman carried no personal effects that might reveal who she was or where she had come from, leaving investigators with only a body and the grim task of trying to determine not just who had killed her, but who she had been in life. The Smith County Sheriff's Office began the standard procedures for identifying an unknown victim, starting with fingerprint analysis and dental record comparisons. The woman's fingerprints were processed through available databases, but no matches were found, indicating she had never been arrested or worked in a job requiring background checks. Her dental work was examined and photographed, then compared against missing person reports and dental records from across Texas and neighboring states. But again, no matches emerged. The lack of any identification documents or personal effects meant investigators had no starting point for their inquiry, no thread to pull that might unravel the mystery of her identity. They canvassed the area where she was found, interviewing local residents and business owners who might have seen anything suspicious. But the remote location of the dump site meant there were few potential witnesses. The absence of any immediate leads or obvious connections to the local area suggested the victim might have been from elsewhere, potentially making identification even more challenging in an era before computerized databases and widespread information sharing between law enforcement agencies. With no identification possible through conventional means, the unknown woman was buried in Restland Cemetery in Tyler, which was situated in an area known locally as Treetop. The burial was a simple affair, attended only by cemetery workers and a representative from the coroner's office, with no family or friends present to mourn her passing or celebrate her life. Her grave was marked with a plain headstone that bore only the designation Jane Doe and the date of her death, a stark monument to a life that had been reduced to an administrative entry in official records. She became known as Treetop Jane Doe, a name that spoke more to the location of her burial than to any aspect of her identity or personality. The case file remained open in the Smith County Sheriff's Office, but without any new leads or evidence to pursue, it gradually moved from active investigation to cold case status. Investigators who worked the case retired. New personnel took their places, and the file containing her photographs and case details was relegated to storage along with hundreds of other unsolved cases that had accumulated over the decades. For 34 years, Treetop Jane Doe existed in a state of administrative limbo, neither forgotten nor actively pursued. Her case file represented one of the most challenging scenarios in law enforcement, a victim without an identity, which made any meaningful investigation virtually impossible. Periodically, her fingerprints and dental records would be compared against new entries in missing person databases, and occasionally a detective would review her case file, hoping to spot some previously overlooked detail. But these efforts yielded no results. The absence of a name meant there was no family pressing for answers, no community demanding justice, no media attention to keep the case in the public eye. She had become one of the estimated 40,000 unidentified human remains scattered across the United States, a silent testament to lives that had ended without explanation or closure. Her case exemplified the tragic reality that without identification, even the most solvable murder case could remain frozen indefinitely, waiting for some breakthrough that might never come. The statistical reality of Treetop Jane Doe's situation reflected a broader problem within the criminal justice system's handling of unidentified remains. Cases like hers often lacked the resources or investigative momentum of typical homicides, because the absence of an identified victim meant there were no obvious starting points for investigation. There were no family members to interview about the victim's relationships or recent activities, no workplace colleagues who might have noticed concerning behavior from someone in the victim's life, no social circle that could provide insights into potential motives or suspects. The case existed in a vacuum, with investigators possessing only the physical evidence from the crime scene and the victim's remains, which were insufficient to generate viable leads or suspects. The passage of time only made the situation more challenging. As potential witnesses moved away or died, memories faded, and the physical evidence aged. For decades, Treetop Jane Doe represented not just an unsolved murder, but an unsolvable one, trapped in a cycle where the very thing needed to investigate the case, her identity, remained the primary obstacle to any progress. The breakthrough that would finally give Treetop Jane Doe her name back came in 2018, when the Smith County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a volunteer organization that used forensic genetic genealogy to identify unknown remains. The DNA Doe Project had been founded by volunteers who recognized that emerging genetic technologies could be applied to cases that had been considered hopeless using traditional investigative methods. Advanced DNA extraction techniques allowed scientists to obtain usable genetic material from Treetop Jane Doe's remains despite their age, and this genetic profile was then analyzed to create a family tree based on matches found in genealogical databases. The process required extensive volunteer labor from genealogists who constructed family trees going back multiple generations, following various family lines to identify potential relatives of the unknown victim. The work was painstaking and required both scientific analysis and traditional genealogical research, as volunteers traced birth records, marriage certificates, and other historical documents to verify family relationships and narrow down potential identities. The genetic genealogy investigation gradually focused on specific family lines that matched the DNA profile from Treetop Jane Doe's remains. Volunteers working on the case constructed detailed family trees and began reaching out to potential relatives to verify family connections and gather additional information about missing family members. The investigation eventually led to a family that had lost touch with a young woman named Tanya Gatlin, who had disappeared from their lives in 1984 under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Family members provided DNA samples that confirmed the match, and after 34 years of anonymity, treetop Jane Doe finally had her name restored. She was Tanya Marie Gatlin, born in 1957, who had been 27 years old at the time of her death. The identification transformed her from a statistic into a person with a history, relationships, and a life that had been cut short by violence, fundamentally changing the nature of the investigation from an identification case to an active homicide inquiry. The identification of Tanya Gatlin immediately opened new avenues of investigation that had been impossible when she was simply an unknown victim. Detectives were now able to examine her personal history, relationships, and the circumstances of her disappearance in 1984. The investigation revealed that Tanya had been married to a man who had provided a simple explanation for her absence from their shared life. He claimed she had run off and joined a cult and had abandoned their marriage without warning. This explanation had apparently been accepted by family members and friends, who had respected what they believed was Tanya's choice to leave her old life behind. Her husband had never filed for divorce or reported her as a missing person, and had eventually moved on with his life, as if Tanya had simply chosen to disappear. The discovery that Tanya had actually been murdered just miles from where she had lived revealed that her husband's 34-year-old explanation had been a carefully constructed lie designed to cover up his involvement in her death. The revelation that Tanya Gatlin had been living in the Tyler area at the time of her death immediately focused the investigation on her husband, who had been the last person known to have seen her alive. Detectives re-examined the circumstances of her disappearance in 1984 and found that her husband's story about her joining a cult had never been questioned or investigated by authorities, who had no reason to doubt his account in the absence of any evidence suggesting foul play. The identification of Tanya's remains proved definitively that his explanation had been false, creating probable cause for his arrest in connection with her murder. The case demonstrated how the simple act of identification could instantly transform a cold case into an active investigation with a clear suspect and motive. Within days of Tanya being identified, her husband was arrested and charged with her murder, bringing an end to a case that had remained unsolvable for over 3 decades solely because the victim's identity had been unknown. The arrest and charging of Tanya Gatlin's husband represented a complete transformation of what had been considered an unsolvable case into a successful prosecution within a matter of days following her identification. The case highlighted the critical importance of victim identification in homicide investigations and demonstrated how modern forensic genetic genealogy could breathe new life into cases that had been considered hopeless using traditional methods. For Tanya's family, the identification brought both closure and renewed grief, as they learned that their relative had not chosen to abandon them, but had been murdered shortly after her disappearance. The case also served as a powerful reminder that behind every unidentified remain was a person with a name, a history, and people who had loved them, even if those connections had been severed by violence and deception. The resolution of Tanya Gatlin's case demonstrated the profound impact that victim identification could have on cold case investigations, transforming an administrative entry about unknown remains into an active homicide prosecution. Her story illustrated how the absence of a name could effectively shield a killer from investigation for decades, while the restoration of that name could instantly expose years of deception and lies. The case joined a growing number of long unidentified victims who had been given back their names through genetic genealogy, providing closure to families and justice for victims who had been forgotten by all except the investigators and volunteers who had never stopped working to identify them. Tanya Gatlin's transformation from treetop Jane Doe to a named victim with a solved case represented not just a victory for forensic science, but a restoration of dignity and recognition for a woman whose life had been brutally ended, but whose identity had finally been reclaimed from decades of anonymity.